Welcome everyone to Mailfuzz TV. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about the Twilight Zone Season 5, Episode 2. It's called Steel. Steel is an episode set in the future, or at least at the time they made the episode it was the future, because they say it's the 70s. But it's after boxing has been outlawed, and instead they use robots for boxing matches. Clearly an inspiration to that movie starring Hugh Jackman from about 10 or so years ago called Real Steel. Very similar kind of concept. Obviously that had these big over-the-top robots and a lot more visual effects and things, but the basic idea is kind of here. This episode I think is pretty solid. It's a pretty solid episode of Twilight Zone. I liked it way more than the last episode. As good as Klugman's performance was in the last one, it couldn't make up for just how weak I think that script was. Here, it's not reinventing the wheel and it's not doing anything super like mind-blowing, but it sets up a simple premise about this guy who, the guy who owns this robot, Steel Kelly. He used to be a boxer, right? When before the laws, he was almost heavyweight champion. Never quite made it, but he was almost there. And now he runs this new robot. It's him and his mechanic Paul, and they take care of this robot and they go on fights. But a big part of this episode, and the main gist of it, is that their robot is old. It's a B2, right? And all the robots that are being used now are B7s and B6s. Maybe you'll get a 5 or a 4, but B2s and B3s don't get used anymore. It's an old model. It's breaking down. They don't make parts for it anymore. That is a subject that comes up repeatedly in this episode, because Steel Kelly is kind of refusing to believe or accept this, and he demands that things be fixed, and his mechanic keeps telling him they don't make parts for this anymore. It's impossible, and no one wants to see one of these robots fight because it's so outdated. Which I think just on that front, like, obviously they're probably comparing this to, when they made this episode, they're probably thinking about cars, they're probably thinking about other mechanical items that existed at the time that would become out of date and you couldn't get parts for them anymore. I feel like, without, predicting anything specific, they kind of almost nail what modern technology is kind of like, and that, like, you get a new phone every couple of years, and they keep making new models of phones and video game consoles and computer hardware. And within a few years, you start to feel like, oh, I need to upgrade. It's starting to feel outdated. And because we're talking about a robot, it's very easy to kind of relate it to those things. Even though at the time, I'm sure they were just thinking about old cars where you can't get the parts anymore, or, anything else that maybe was common to repair at the time. So I think that just is an interesting little bit of the world that they build around this. But the main gist of this, of course, is this character, Steel Kelly, who is refusing to accept that his robot's done, that he's washed up and needs to be replaced. And it's not really that much of a stretch to then take that to its logical theme, its logical analysis, is that he sees any criticisms on his robot as a criticism on him. He feels like he's washed up, that he's out of his prime, that he can't go anymore. Very quickly, when he's talking about all the accomplishments that his robot's made, when he's trying to pitch him to, they show up to the fight that they've got arranged. They're lucky to get this fight. B2s aren't used anymore, but it was an emergency, so they needed a fill-in robot. And sure enough, they're going to get paid $500 to be in this fight. But the mechanic keeps saying the robot's not going to make it through the fight. It's falling apart. It can't do anything. It's not going to work. But Steel Kelly still talks him up. He still talks about his robot like he's a big deal. And very quickly, he starts pivoting to his own success, or his own near success. He starts talking about how I used to be a prize fighter before the laws changed, and he starts talking about it. So much like a lot of Twilight Zone characters, he's kind of living in the past a little bit. Not in a delusional, more grounded delusion as opposed to actual delusion of going into the past, like a lot of characters in the Twilight Zone do when they literally go into the past. At least they think they do anyway. This character is a bit more grounded in his delusion, and that he's just refusing to accept that his days are, like, his prime is over, and he sees that the robot is an extension of that. And maybe on some level it kind of extended what would have been his prime because it's a robot, but technology does get outdated. Things move on much quicker than people, really, when you start, especially these days when you think about it. The big hook of the episode that sort of gives us our big kind of hook into the second half is that when they go to the locker room and they test out the robot, whose wheels, because they've got like it's like roller skates on its feet to move it around when it's not been used. The wheels keep falling off, things are popping out, and he does a little shadow boxing with it to see if it like can still go. And very quickly something pops out and it's done. It's broken. They cannot fix it. Certainly not in time for the fight, which is in a matter of minutes or hours or however long it is. So Steel gets the idea. No one knows what he looks like, so I'll be him. I'll do the fight, and it makes the association that he has with his robot and sort of living through him, he's going to literally step into the robot's shoes and have the fight, which is illegal, and no one ever catches him, and that's not really the point of the episode. The point of the episode is that he shouldn't be doing this anymore. And even in the real world where, boxing still exists, there's certainly past a certain age where you really shouldn't be doing this anymore. But you can't let go of your glory days. You can't let go of your youth. You can't let go of this idea that you're getting older and you can't do these things anymore. And that's very much what this character is doing. And as soon as he brings this up, I actually thought, oh, this is a cool idea, actually. This makes sense that this is where the episode's going. So I thought it felt like a very natural direction. But it did make me wonder, well, what happens exactly when you fight this robot, this B7, this new model robot? Do you stand a chance because you're human, or are you going to get pummeled because this thing is stronger than you are, because this thing doesn't feel pain, so on, so on. And quite quickly, the mechanic's like, no, this thing's going to pummel you. You're not going to last a round. And sure enough, the fight does only last one round. And it's a very quick watch of an episode because a lot of the back half is the fight, right? It's the walk to the ring where he's got the sheet over his head and you can't, and he pretends to be a robot, so he sort of stands up and sits down all robotically. And it's not until the sort of initiate fight mode that the robots take more of a sort of natural looking stance. And so he mimics that. He mimics that and goes into fight mode and then just tries to fight. But obviously he's sweating, he's struggling, he's feeling the pain of the hits. And he lasts longer than I think the mechanic implied he was going to, which is maybe the spiritual victory for him a little bit. Because at the end of the fight, he can barely stand. He can barely stand up. He's in pain. He tells his mechanic to sneak him to the back with his robe and that back on. And as soon as they get back to the locker room, he just collapses to the floor. And the mechanic has to put something under his head. Like, he is absolutely destroyed. He's tired. He's in pain. All these things. And the mechanic goes and gets paid for the job and says they only got half because it only lasted one round. To which Steel very quickly he's upset about it, but then he quickly says, okay, look, that'll pay for our bus ticket back to so and so, and we can buy these parts with that money, and we'll get him back up and running. He'll be in his prime again, won't he, Paul? And the mechanic, the whole episode, whose name's Paul, in case you didn't get that from what I just said, he's been the one since the very first scene of this episode saying, no, we have to decommission him. We have to somehow raise money for a newer model robot. Maybe not a brand new B7, but we can maybe get like a used B5 for something that we can afford and use him in a reasonable amount of fights and actually make some money again. He's been saying this all episode. He's been saying that you can't buy parts for this thing. You can't fix him. He's been very realistic to the point where it feels like he is fighting a delusion that the other guy has. But at the end of the episode, when Steele's lying there, beaten, sweaty, and he almost sounds like he's talking like a delusional man. Where he's like, "Yeah, we'll fix him up. We'll get a few springs. We'll get some oil, and he'll be right as rain, won't he? He'll be in his prime again." And Paul, for the first time in the episode, doesn't fight back. He just says, "Of course he will," and that's when the episode ends. Because I think Paul himself perhaps realizes here at the end of the episode why Steel cares so much about fixing up this robot, by not replacing him. This idea that he's speaking more about his friend Steel than he is about the robot at this point, and I think he realizes that. And it's not so much that I think for sure, oh, he's going to fix this up and it will be fine afterwards. He still needs to kind of learn this eventually, but if anything, the arc of the episode is the mechanic realizing why this idea of just abandoning their current robot is so painful and something that Steele just doesn't want to do, because he sees it as abandoning himself, and that we're moving on to the younger people, we're moving on to the younger robot, and things like that. So I think it's a really simple episode in terms of its themes, in terms of its message, but it's a fun concept for an episode. Him pretending to be a robot's fun. The robot, when you see it in the locker room, and the other robot that he fights in the fight. So we see two robots in this episode. It's obviously just actors playing as robots, but they do add some makeup to their face to make their face look, well, fake, I guess. Like, they want the face to look not quite human. You know, like it's made of rubber or something like that. Honestly, it's fine. It's a perfectly kind of weird looking face that works for the idea that this is not a real person. I think the problem is that when you look at the arms of the robot, you can tell it's just regular human arms. You know, there's a different texture to the arms than there is the face, and that is maybe a little bit of a disconnect. You know, so you have to suspend your disbelief a little bit with that, and just go with it. But it's not a huge deal, because I think the core idea of the episode, of this boxer who is trying to still feel like he's a big deal when no one else cares, and it's almost kind of it's almost kind of sweet, and like not adorable. That's not the word I'm looking for. He's endearing, as maybe is the word I'm looking for. He's endearing because despite everyone else around him, he refuses to quit believing in himself. Now, maybe at some point, yes, he has to face reality, and it's a bit of a problem that he's not accepting that in any way, shape, or form. But there is kind of maybe a nice message as well, that he had to go out and learn this the hard way, that his days of doing this are over, right? It's kind of a sweet idea that when no one else believes in him, even his friend, even though they're not really talking about him directly, that's kind of how he's always feels like he's taking it. He's living vicariously through this robot that he's trying to maintain. And by trying to say he's not done, he doesn't need to be replaced, he's saying that about himself. He's saying that he's not old, that he's not done. And that simple idea carries the episode. I think the performances of Lee Marvin, who plays Steel Kelly, obviously a very famous actor. I think him and Joe Mantell, who play Paul, have good chemistry. They bounce off each other very well. The episode feels perfectly paced. You get them talking in the little coffee shop or bar, whatever it is, about what's going on. It sets up the world. It sets up the basic principles of the rules of this world and how the fights work. Makes you understand that they're robots. I actually think I really like as well that the exposition felt very natural to me, in a way that I think a good bit of writing does it, where they just start talking about the fact that he's a B2 and how, like, no one uses a B2 anymore and he can't find the parts. Like, it's all, like, at no point did they say, we box with robots, this is our robot, and he's not working very well. They say it in a way that it makes sense for people who live in the world that are already using these things. They don't have to explain that they're robots. You just get from the context of the statements that, okay, it's a B2 and they don't make any new parts for that. That tells me it's a robot. It tells me that it's an old robot. It gets the exposition across in a very natural way that I think makes you feel like it's fun to be in the world. It feels like it's a living, breathing world around them that makes sense. And it's only a 25-minute story. It doesn't have to make that much sense, but enough that the context of what the story's playing out in feels like it's surrounded by reality in some way. It doesn't have to be our reality, it just has to be a reality. And you feel that when it doesn't feel like they're having to stop and explain things. It feels like all the explanations are coming out very naturally. Everything down to the idea that he's a last-minute replacement for another robot that was in a car accident. So they just have to make do with this shitty old thing. And all this good stuff. So I had a good time with this. I don't think it's necessarily like a standout best of all time episode for Twilight Zone by any means, but I think it's a solid character story. It does well with its scenes and its pacing. And, I wasn't a fan of the last episode, so this felt really nice to sit down and just kind of enjoy the story like this. And for the episode to use its time wisely. So that was really nice, especially since, we just did season 4 and those episodes were all double length and a lot of them suffered from feeling too long. This was like, okay, it was nice to get back to 25 minutes last week, but this was like, okay, here's a really well paced and constructed 25 minutes, and now I'm feeling like, oh, we're back again. We're back, baby. Twilight Zone's starting to cook. And what's surprising is I'm pretty sure this episode is lower rated on IMDb than the last one, but I think this one was better than In Praise of Pip. Maybe Pip gets a lot of praise for the performance, and I can understand that to an extent, but I think this was a better overall story. So maybe people will disagree with me on that, I'm not sure, but you can let me know in the comments. Next time on the Twilight Zone, Rod of course tells us about Nightmare at 20,000 feet at the end of the episode, and I feel like I barely need to even mention anything about this. It is arguably the most famous episode of the Twilight Zone, which is why it's nuts that it doesn't happen until season 5. Time Enough at Last is big, Monsters of Due in Maple Street, like there's other really big ones, but I feel like this was the first Twilight Zone story that I ever knew about. This was definitely the one that I heard this be referenced numerous times before I ever heard of any other Twilight Zone episode. Before I knew it was Twilight Zone, I just heard of there's something on the wing. So excited to finally see this episode next time and talk about it. So we'll see how that is. I think my cat's about to throw up, so I'm going to go and deal with that. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Support us on patreon.com/MailFuzzTV. Goodbye. Keep watching TV in the Twilight Zone.